I want to say a few things about today versus the rest of the study. If you are a history buff, you're going to like today. If you're not, you're going to go, oh, that hurts. Okay, so it already hurts, doesn't it? But I want to say two things to you. Number one, hang in there. It will pay off once we get into our actual study of Daniel. To start Daniel and not do this will make Daniel much more confusing when it doesn't have to be. Okay, so I'm actually, this is like eating your vegetables, okay? This is, it's for our good that we do this. But once we get into, the first 6 chapters of Daniel are these great, extraordinary stories of faith that really are not that hard to follow. And then once we hit chapters 7 through 12, he's going to get into some more figurative language that probably will resemble the book of Revelation a little bit. But I will say the study of Daniel might also take the fear of the book of Revelation out. Because if you just kind of get the hang of how apocalyptic and figurative language works, you become more and more comfortable. I don't want you to be afraid of Daniel. I don't want you to be afraid of Ezekiel or the book of Revelation. They're profound, important messages, but we just have to devote ourselves to looking into it. I don't want to run away from it. I just want to, with a reverent spirit, look at this and strive to learn. So some of this you'll be fairly familiar with. Some of the names, don't worry. There's only 2 dates I want you to really hang on to. And I'm going to get you all these notes in notebook form as soon as I can. So if you're taking notes and you don't get everything, because you're probably not going to get everything, it's okay. I'm going to give you all these notes in a notebook form. The 2 dates, I'll go ahead and tell you, and I'll explain why in a moment, that are important, that are really, really important, is going to be, depending on what timeline you're looking at, 606 or 605. So we'll say 605 BC, and I'll explain why in a moment, and 586 BC. That's a big one. Okay, and you have to set the time frame here. I'll mention one more thing to you as we begin the book of Daniel, and that is that this is a major section as far as the discussion with skeptics and unbelievers, and you'll see why. We'll eventually get into that too. If we don't talk about this issue with our young people, Daniel sometimes comes up, and I know you might be surprised by that, and I'll explain why as we move through. It is a major defense of God's knowledge and wisdom and the inspiration of Scripture. And it has to do with the dating of Daniel. If Daniel has the traditional early date that I believe that it does, and that scholarship for thousands of years believes that it does, then there is just no way to deny the inspiration of the Bible because of the detailed prophetic sections. Now, what has happened is modernistic, skeptical scholars, and I've even heard this in some colleges that claim to be very religious and would even claim to be very conservative, will try to push the dating of the book of Daniel much later so it is not actually as predictive as what it seems to be. Why do they do that particularly with Daniel? Because Daniel is devastating if it has the early date that we think that it does, okay? So that's the relevance of this, number one. The theme of Daniel is going to have to do with the sovereignty of God. So there's all kinds of good things about the book of Daniel. So as we move through this, just know, there's going to be the payoff of understanding the context and being impressed with what is actually going on. Okay, so let's try to get into this. Of course, as I mentioned to you, Daniel is one of the most fascinating and popular prophets in the Bible. It is somewhat unique. It stands with books like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, but especially Ezekiel. If you were to read Daniel and Ezekiel, they'll have a lot of similarity to them. Daniel is going to be important as far as Scripture is concerned, just generally speaking. Let me come over here. Now that's not going to work. Give me just a minute. Try this. Well, I have to get in the pulpit and do this the old-fashioned way. Well, I don't want to do it, but I will. Okay. There we go. Okay, so as we break this down, as I mentioned to you, the first 6 chapters of Daniel is going to encourage all of us to be stronger believers. So that's going to be pretty practical. That's probably the section a lot of people are most familiar with. And you find out why when you get into Daniel 7 through 12, but it's all one whole message. Chapter 7 through 12 is going to get into more of the apocalyptic and predictive prophecy that can be a challenge to all of us. So this is not one of those things you go into and you just maybe quickly know right off the top of your head, but it will be important and it's going to strengthen your faith as you progress. I mentioned to you some of the reasons why it can be controversial, why we need to talk about it, even from the standpoint of the foundation of our faith. And I talked about the later date there. Okay, so let's talk about Daniel as it reveals who God is. And that's a major section. You will see throughout the book of Daniel this notion of God and his kingdom and his sovereignty. But just notice some of the attributes of God that we're going to see in Daniel. So when I'm reading a book or you're reading a book and we're studying the scripture, I think the first thing we need to ask is, what do I learn about God from this text? I mean, once I kind of know what the message of the text is, what do I learn about God? What do I learn about his nature? And it doesn't matter what verse you're reading, you can always begin by asking that question. Well, we learn about God's divine foreknowledge. Again, if the early traditional date is correct, I believe that it is, then you're looking at God's foreknowledge. You see God's wisdom, his power, his purpose, his plan. But it even goes further than that. It narrates miraculous events. You have the total sovereign authority of God. And you also have the providence of God without negating free will. Because this text makes it very clear that he, during that time, was interacting with human governments. So it wasn't, you can't have a deistic view of God. And what I mean by that is, God just kind of winds everything up and sits back and watches it unwind and is not involved or is detached somehow. He's outside of time and space, but he's not detached. He is interacting with his people. We also see, this will be interesting, we'll see angels, particular angels, it seems good and wicked angels, associated with certain rulers at that time. And that's very interesting as well as we see this go on. Okay, so let's talk about the history that's important as far as lying behind the book. Now, is everybody okay? Just shake your head. You're ambulatory. Okay, good. All right. Let's talk about how the Babylonian Empire was in power when I believe Daniel wrote this. Has anybody heard of the Maccabean Revolt? Anybody? Some of you have. That's much later, and we will eventually talk about that. There was a man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and persecuted the Jews in Jerusalem. It was terrible. But that's more like an intertestamental time. There is some literature that didn't belong in the canon, but it gives us a good historical review of that. Things like demanding that the Jews eat unclean food. Now, this is before the transition of the covenants, of course. And now this is going to be graphic, but sticking pork in their mouth and cutting their head off. And just defiling them, and it was terrible. My personal conviction is toward the end of Daniel, there will be some referencing of that. Okay. Those who take the later date want to say this was written then as if it was looking to the future, but really it wasn't. I don't believe that, okay? I believe it's written in the life of Daniel. I don't think that's a figurative usage of a name or anything like that. It's written by Daniel. He's in Babylon, just like what you're going to read in those first few chapters. So, the Neo-Babylonian Empire had begun in 626 BC with the Chaldean leader Nabopolassar. He captured Babylon. He declares independence from Assyria. Now, Assyria was a major empire too. Babylon's going to overcome them. He then makes an alliance with the Medes and captured the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. Nineveh probably ring the bell for you a little bit. The Assyrians and their Egyptian allies were completely defeated in 605 BC. So Assyria connected with Egypt, and they were defeated by what would be Babylon. And that happened by the general Nebuchadnezzar. You're more familiar with the name Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, he's the leader here. He was the son of Nabopolassar. Okay? Daniel is, and let's read Daniel chapter 1 just to kind of give a framework to this. Daniel chapter 1. Daniel's the first seen at the beginning of the captivity of Judah in Babylon. Okay, and you remember, that's what's going on. You have this Babylonian captivity. Some of the leading citizens are taken off. Renowned citizens are taken off in this Babylonian empire. And Nebuchadnezzar wants the really, unblemished, undefiled, most intelligent people with him in his court, especially young men. So let's read Daniel chapter 1, and let's read verses 1 through 7. Alan, would you mind reading that, please? Thank you. So we'll talk about more of the significance of all of that, but this timing I'm trying to give you is when all of that has taken place. Does anybody, I know you can look up on the board, who was the last good king? Josiah. Josiah, right there. Josiah, the last good king. Okay. But yeah, that's right. It was Josiah. We remember he's special, young. We've talked about, he became king when he was 8, and then you have when he was 16 and 20, he's tearing down the idols and finding the book of the law and all of those kinds of things. So he's the last good king. He had been killed by the Egyptians at Megiddo. Now remember time frame, okay? 609. Now you don't have to worry about that. I just want you to know it's 609 BC. He's succeeded by his son Jehoahaz. After Josiah, what was one of the problems with the people with Josiah? So he tears down the idols and all that. What happens after Josiah, though? Yeah, you can tear down, and that was the right thing for him to do, is tear down all the altars and all of that. But you got to get it out of people's hearts. And so they go right back into all of that, and what you find out is that After Josiah, the blessing for Josiah is he was going to rest with his fathers before he had to see that. He didn't have to see all of that. So Jehoahaz was his son. He reigned for 3 months, and he was then deposed by Pharaoh Necho of Egypt in 2 Kings. So he goes with Egypt. The Pharaoh replaced Jehoahaz with his brother. Now this is going to get real fun. Jehoiakim. Okay, so Jehoiakim is replacing Jehoahaz. That's in 609 to 598 BC. Okay? Jehoiakim serves Necho until 605 BC. Now, I told you 605 is important. 605 BC is when Nebuchadnezzar defeats Egypt and Assyria at Carchemish. 605 is when Babylon is really on a tear. Okay, they're taking everything. All right, following this conquest in 605, Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to Jerusalem and eventually captures the city. That's in 2 Kings 24 and verse 1. The siege took place in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim. That's Daniel 1:1. So if you just read the book of Daniel, you could just read that and not think about it. I want you to understand this is a big deal. Here comes Nebuchadnezzar. How is God using Nebuchadnezzar? Punishment. You remember the book of Habakkuk and the story of Habakkuk? What was Habakkuk's complaint about Judah? Wickedness. He talks about how unjust they are and all of this, and what did he think God ought to do? Punish them. Until, what did God say he was going to do to Habakkuk? Chaldeans, Nebuchadnezzar. Now he had used Assyria in a similar way. With Israel, with Judah, he's coming and he's going to bring Nebuchadnezzar, and there's a sense in which Nebuchadnezzar is his instrument of punishment. What was Habakkuk's problem with that? Yeah, I mean, Nebuchadnezzar, if you want to get a view of what Nebuchadnezzar was like, all you have to do is read Habakkuk. It's only 3 chapters, especially chapter 2. He was a bloodthirsty, violent, pagan, idol-worshiping, military is my God, might is my God, I'll take what I want and get out of my way kind of guy, okay? Which a lot of those folks were. So he could, in his mind, rationalize, how does God use somebody who seems worse than we are? And of course, God says, I'll take care of him too. I'll punish him too, but I'm going to use him right now for my purposes. So God can use wicked people without himself being wicked for his divine purpose. Alan, and I'll come back to you, Tom. Alan. That's right. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Because Egypt had that alliance with Assyria. So in defeating Assyria, when they take Egypt, they're taking everybody involved there. That's right. And so it's movement. In fact, Habakkuk is written, I mean, we would put it right about 606. It's right before they get there. I say several years before they get there. So they're moving. What year did they take Jerusalem? 5. It's a few years out. 586. And I'll explain. Actually, 588, they're there. We'll get to that in a minute. But to Alan's point, is its movement toward, because Habakkuk cries out, and in chapter 3, he says, they're coming, I'm quivering, I'm scared. He describes this mighty army, and he says, yet I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. And that's the last we hear about Habakkuk, so I'm sure he was taken like others. So you have a few years, but you see movement of Babylon. That's what I'm saying, though. They're just taking more and more and more, okay? So, Tom, what did you? Yeah. Yeah. At that time, yeah. Yeah. Cyrus is another one called his servant for a different reasons, but nonetheless, that's a good point. Okay, so the siege takes place in the third year of Jehoiakim. 605 BC was also when Daniel and many other young men were taken to Babylon for training. So Daniel is taken in 605. Okay, all right, let's keep going. Jehoiakim dies in 598 BC. He succeeded, you're going to like this one, by Jehoiakim. Can you remember that? If you want to say Jeconiah or Coniah, the Bible also uses those terms to kind of separate that out. But nonetheless, Jehoiakim dies in 598, rebels against Nebuchadnezzar, not a good idea. Okay, just, that's a small tad prophesying to God's people. Do you remember what the one thing they had that they thought proved that God was okay with them and that what Jeremiah was saying was just, he's 21. Sammy, can you do just that verse? You know, kind of popularistic.